Welcome, everyone. Live from my mother's office. I am in between homes right now, and I thought that since I'm growing such awesome, huge facial hair, I would bring on my friend who's a facial hair expert, Josh.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the compliment. Yes, I am also in your same boat, not homeless, but growing a beautiful mustache. I'll let the comments decide what they think.
Okay, great. We don't get many comments, but I'm hoping that they're nice to you.
This one
Um,
will peek out.
I am bringing on Josh because Josh is a Christian but has crazy, wild theories and conspiracy theories and hot takes on everything. So I thought he'd be so interesting to have on.
When
Um,
Kyle says conspiracy theories, he means scientific views of the world,
okay.
just so everyone knows.
Josh has taught me a lot in the past few years. I met Josh at college. He is a dear friend. Um, Played some tennis, played some Smash on the Switch, and that's pretty much all he ever did. But he obviously got into science, and I'm going to ask Josh a few questions about this. I think everyone will find it interesting. Joshua Hall.
That is me. I also, before we get started, I kind of did want to say that Um, I do, I have looked into science and I have a degree in biology, but I'm not like an expert on science or anything like that. Or, you know, all of all of the things we're going to be talking about today, I don't have a full expertise on. These are just my thoughts on them.
No
So
problem. I can help
please
you
take it
out.
away. Thank you.
I can help you out if you get confused. No problem. Um, so, Josh, early in life, spoiler, you were homeschooled.
Oh gosh, don't tell people that.
So tell people what you grew up learning, how you learned, what you learned is specifically about faith and science and the Bible.
Yeah. So I guess starting out, to to kind of get into your first question about faith. I was very lucky to be raised in a home that had a very um, where faith was taken very seriously, and I had two parents that really wanted to um, have their kids follow along in that and press that into them. Um, so yeah, that's what happened in my household. I was homeschooled, and I was we had a section in our day when we would, study the Bible, and um, it was good. Honestly, I think it was a good to have a understanding of the Bible as as a young person too.
I will cut
More
in
than
and
just
say, I'll cut in and say Josh knows a lot about the Bible. He's known for this. Quiz him on trivia.
don't
And he
don't
has a
say any of
lot
that.
of passages recited. Yes.
No, no, no. We're gonna edit that out. But
Okay.
anyways, um, my 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 interest always from when I was young was biologic life. I love animals. I love plants. Um, so I could see myself going in that direction. And um, in school, high school, I was taught a young Earth creationist view, which is, I guess, a view of the world, a worldview where everything that is taught in the Genesis account of um, creation is literal. So on day one, God made light. Uh, on day six, he made the animals and people. So that all of that is exactly how it happened. That's the view a young Earth creationist would have, um, and they would believe that happened between 7 and 6,000 years ago. I
I got
hope that
you.
data, maybe that'll help.
Okay. Yeah, young Earth view, literal meaning of Genesis. This is what you grew up with, and that's roughly, so that means that the Earth is roughly how many years old?
So that is the general consensus is between 6 and 7,000 years old.
Okay. How, and you grew up, did you think anything of that when you were young? Until what age did you think
Um,
anything different?
yeah, that's a good question. For the majority of my childhood, until I didn't question that until I was about 17, 16. Um, I just, I had that worldview and I thought that was the only, I guess I didn't think it was the only view, but that was my main view of how everything came to happen. Um, yeah, when I was 17, I was really into dinosaurs still. I know, way too late to still be into dinosaurs.
You are, and you own a Jurassic Park tank top that you wear in
No,
public.
don't tell people that.
It's
Come
okay,
on.
keep going.
I wear it to the gym, not in public. Thank you. Ugh. But anyways, when I started doing more of a deep dive into like paleontology and um, dinosaurs, that kind of led me to evolution. Um, and that made me question things, obviously. I was like, wait, is any of this actually what's happening? Or so that's kind of my backstory with young Earth creationism and when I started to question.
Okay. I would ask you to describe old Earth creationism, but I feel like that's just kind of more of a mainstream view, secular, scientific view of how the Earth came to be.
Yeah, I'll edit you a little bit there. The main view of how everything came to be is wouldn't include creationism at all.
Sorry. Yeah, not a higher power, nobody behind the scenes.
Right. And some views of old Earth creationism take that idea that Genesis is still correct. It still happened in 6 days, or yeah, 6 days, but it was, a really long time ago, like either many millions of years or billions of years. Um, the view I like to describe myself as having now is a theistic evolutionist. So, a view of the world that evolution was created by God to as a process to drive life.
Okay. Um, and when it comes to the New Testament, there aren't really any issues with this. Even later in the Old Testament, when it comes to Persia, Babylon, Assyria. There's not a huge issue with this, but Genesis is the main focus because Genesis covers a huge part of history if you go the old Earth way, I guess you could say.
Right.
Um, so how, what were your first feelings when you thought, okay, I'm a theistic evolutionist. I believe this now. I kind of find it to be true. But you grew up believing the Bible is true. So what did you do with Genesis?
Yeah, it was kind of nerve-wracking because I obviously wanted to keep my faith. Um, and I think I've done a good job of that. I was worried that if I looked into this too deeply at starting out, that it would say that I can't be a Christian anymore. And I was very worried about that.
Mm.
But I don't think that's true. I think that's that's a misconception some people would have. I think if you can you can look at something and be incorrect about it, but as long as you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to Christianity and science. You can have the best of both worlds, I believe.
Okay, because that's another question I was thinking of. Is mainstream science and the Bible at odds? And you don't think they're mutually exclusive?
No, I don't. Um, I think they can work together. It's just an interpretation that is important. So when it comes to Genesis, to get back to your original question, I think if you can interpret that as a story for um, all people of how God created and God is in control of the universe, then is it answers your questions in a way that a science textbook wouldn't, but is in some ways more important than a science textbook for those questions. Like, how did we? What's our relationship like? What does God want for us? You know,
Yeah.
I think those things are important too. And if you just discard all of that, that would be a mistake.
Okay, agreed. Um, I know that the Bible is a collection of letters and poetry and historical works. Um, and just there's a section called wisdom literature even. So when you read Jesus is different. I feel like you and I can both agree that Jesus needs to be real in a physical sense, and the miracles that happened around Jesus's ministry need to be real in order for us to believe that somebody rose from the dead, that rose himself from the dead. So we have like a literal confidence that that happened. We're putting faith in that. But there's also stories and truth and obviously lessons to learn from the parables and the way he's trying to show us how to live in relationship with other people. If you read Genesis as a historical text alone, then it just kind of sounds like a messed up, weird story, I feel like, with some violence, with some redeeming characters. Um, but do you view Genesis as more of like a meta narrative? Like you mentioned it, like you can put yourself in those stories almost. Like it's not just um, like a retelling of World War One or something. You think it's
Right.
deeper and you can pull something deeper from that. You're not discounting it as saying, I like the Bible, but Genesis is crazy and it's not true.
Right.
You just have a more nuanced view, I guess.
Right. And this might this example might not work as well as I would hope it to, but it would be like saying that Jesus's parable on the lost sheep isn't important because it's just a story.
Yeah.
There's obviously great importance to be gleaned from that story, even though it never truly happened.
Yeah. That's true. And some people might say, well, that's God talking. So obviously it's more important. But at the same time, if you put any faith in the fact that these scriptures were spirit inspired, then there's definitely good meaning behind those stories in the Old Testament somehow. So, okay, the part that like I grew up in a similar way, a young Earth creationist viewpoint, and I am not completely sold on this terrible dark rabbit hole that you've brought yourself down. Um, but I've learned a lot. And I want to know, we've talked about this before, but what do you make of the importance of those really important pivotal moments in the Genesis story? Like, for example, we've talked about creation. In the literal sense, everything was literally perfect on Earth. Then man literally decided to mess it up on day 6 or 8 or 9 or whatever. And with that, with that terrible decision, now there comes corruption, now there comes pain, all these sins and the earth, and they're punished. They have to um, work the ground and do all these terrible things. So, what do you make of that story? Do you think it's more like that story of Adam and Eve lives in all of us? We're made in his image and we get to decide every day to do good or do evil? Or do you think maybe there was a more pivotal moment where something happened or what?
Yeah, I think to answer your question well, I'd like to talk just a little bit about evolutionary history.
Yeah.
So, in the theory of evolution, life evolved roughly mm, many, probably around 7 billion years ago. Um, and then was in a single cellular, multicellular, small state for another 2 billion years. Um, and we people only came around about roughly 300,000 years ago.
Very
So,
recent in the grand scheme.
right. In the scheme of billions of years, um, yeah, we are humans would be very, very new. Um, so your question about that pivotal moment, one of the hardest struggles for me, and I still have questions about it, is in the Genesis story, God creates life and he says it's good. Well, for a theistic evolutionist, they have to look at all of evolutionary history and see, animals eating each other, disease, death, fighting,
Suffering.
suffering. They have to look at that and think, what does God mean when he says that is good? Because that if you don't throw out that part of the story, you're saying that's good. And that's really hard. It's really hard to do. I would think, you know, you could pivot and say that the way God has made life to be resilient and strong and changing is the good part. But yeah, that's very hard to have a world where supposedly no human sin has occurred yet because humans haven't entered the world yet.
Yeah.
And yet you still have what would be considered by most Christian views a somewhat fallen world.
Yeah, for sure.
So
That
if there was a moment, and I go back and forth on this, thinking there was a moment when sin entered caused by man and not. I do, yeah, I go back and forth on that. I haven't fully figured that out. And I
okay.
don't think I ever will. Sorry.
No,
Just to
that's totally
make that
fine.
clear.
I don't think any of us will fully figure out that question or any of these questions really. Um, on this side of heaven. That's a term. The Noah story, with the ark is a popular story in the book of Genesis, and I think that there would be some scientific qualms with the story, how it's laid out. Um, I have two thoughts on it. One is that it does kind of sound like there's a lot of flood narratives in many different ancient cultures. It seems like every ancient culture throughout the world has some flood narrative. So whether they were just scared of it happening and it grew up in the culture or some sort of flood did happen, either way, it's very popular. And I think um, on one end of it, where am I trying to go with this? It either sounds like someone just tried to come up with a way to tell their grandkids how the animals came about. And they said, oh, and he brought two of every animal on the boat. Because one of the kids asked, well, how did the donkey get here? And he's like, he brought two of those too. And on the other side, you could say, oh, the story happened just like the other miracles in life happened. And if you disagree with it because you say, well, that just doesn't make any sense, there's not enough genetic diversity, then you're saying, like, God can't do it. It doesn't make sense. Why would you believe in some miracles and not others? That's the other side of it, which I know it's an extreme. Um, but I don't know. What is your idea of that story and similar Genesis stories?
Yeah, I have caused many fights to break out in our Bible study that we have
Yeah.
when I say I don't believe in Noah's Ark. Oh gosh. As a literal interpretation that every animal, two of every animal on Earth got onto a boat and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the whole Earth, everything except what was living on the ark, died. Um, some would say that's just another miracle that the animals could inbreed and just be fine. And to that, I say that's fine to have that view. My, I don't view, I don't view, I don't want to say I don't view God that way, but it's kind of true. I don't view God in he uses miracles to fix lack of like interpretation in science. You know what I mean?
Okay, yeah.
I don't know if I'm explaining that quite right, but yeah, I don't see that as being I see it more as a story of, you know, when you're a kid and your grandma tells you about the biggest tornado she
Yeah.
ever saw. The tornado of 72 almost took your mom's head off.
Yeah.
So I kind of see it as like a warning slash recounting of a flood that may have happened and
Yeah.
what what it's also the moral of that story in the end is you gotta even if everyone else is saying no to God, you have got to be the one to say yes to God. And I think that's a really good moral to have.
Yeah, I agree. And that makes sense. Going off what you're saying, Adam and Eve have kids, Cain and Abel. And I was just mentioning to you earlier, I was listening to the Bible Project and they kind of told me that like the name Abel in Hebrew means a vapor, like here 1 minute and gone the next. And the story of Cain and Abel, is like supposed to be the first murder. They're the sons of Adam and Eve. One pretty much out of bitterness and frustration kills the brother. The one who dies is called a vapor. Um, the brother who killed him is Cain, and one of Cain's descendants, Lamech, his name in Hebrew means to take something. And he's the first man to practice polygamy, and it shows him taking two women instead of one, and it's viewed negatively. This just shows that his name probably, he wasn't born with the name of Vapor, but when the stories came down, that's what this character was called. whether that literally happened with two people and they forgot the name, or it's just a story that has wisdom in it and that was the name that was given. What I probably figured out is that if that did happen, that man's name was probably not Abel, and Cain's descendant was probably not Lamech. Maybe it was a common name at the time used, but that just kind of goes along with the idea that Genesis is not the same type of literature that even like First and Second Chronicles are, or something. It's definitely different.
Yeah. Like King David's name was David.
Yeah,
Abel's name was not Abel.
yeah,
It it's it's very interesting to see to note that difference in biblical history.
yeah.
I think it is.
So now that you're labeled as this terrible person, it's time for you to defend yourself just a little bit. What are some misconceptions that Christians might have about your viewpoint or about evolutionary biology in general, um, that I don't know, that you'd want to mention? Are there any misconceptions, things that you'd want to clear the air on?
I think the biggest issue Christians have when they think about evolution is they see that line of, you know, little monkey, slightly bigger monkey, monkey that's hunched, and
Yeah.
then a person.
Some of
And
us
they're
got
like,
stuck in the middle a little bit and didn't fully get to the other side.
and they think and they look at that and they say, "You're calling my grandma a hunched monkey? That's not my grandma is not hunched. Well, she is, but don't call her a monkey." You
Exactly.
know, they're they and it's excusable. Everyone has a certain amount of years that they've been alive, and it none of it compares to history, just how big and long and huge it is. That time is the big difference between, evolution and and what happens. I think if you can accept that a wolf can turn into a dog, you should be able to accept the theory of evolution as, people get stuck on, a fish turning into a human. Well, it doesn't work like that. Obviously. That is crazy.
So
It's
it's the same concept, just stretched over a way larger sample
right.
space than anything we're used to.
Right. Yes, exactly. I've heard many young Earth creationists say, well, I believe in microevolution, but macroevolution is not, that can't be. And they're really, the only difference there is chronological time between those two things. I know that doesn't, when you hear it, it doesn't sound right, but it's true. The changes are not, the changes are only crazy because of time.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good one. I have one last question for you, and maybe this is a good one to end on. So where do you see God's design or fingerprints in biology, even through natural processes like evolution? I think that there's a broader question, which is like, why do you still believe in God? But I'm not going to go that way because that's multifaceted. I'm going to stay with biology. Um, what gives you faith? What convinces you that there's someone behind all of this stuff that you're learning about?
When I look at the purely scientific view of how life began, um, basically that molecules clump together in hot and wet environments and proteins were formed. And a billion years later, those proteins got lucky enough to click together into DNA. It That's an insufficient view of how it could have started. Additionally, when I look at nature and I see the way that niches are filled, it's insufficient to me that random chance caused those niches to be filled. I think someone pushed a gene or a genome, you know, to become something um, that would fit well in that niche. So I see God's hand in evolution at the very core of evolution in those changes. I see him prompting that.
Yeah. And
Um,
I've talked a lot about just like humans, what makes us special, being made in God's image. Do you feel like the product of humans through that evolution and what we're capable of, good and evil, does that lead you to there's got to be something pushing that too?
yes, definitely, definitely. Yeah, it's very. It would be hard to deny when you look at other people too that there's something more than just um, molecules. You
Yeah.
know, yeah, I see him in, when I look at the our hand versus a fish's fin, you know,
Yeah.
and to see there are, some similarities in the bones there. I see him in that. I don't That's just my view. I'm sure a lot of people would think differently, but I think it's a once you can get there and see that these things could come from God, that's all I want you to think about. Is maybe evolution could be from God, I
Yeah.
guess, is what I would suggest to people.
That's inspiring. I have, obviously, you're very biased because you grew up Christian, and you even said at the beginning you really didn't want to lose hold of that. But I do have a theory that if you have an open mind and if you are looking for a higher power, I feel like no matter what field you dive into, whether it's biology, psychology, or mathematics, you come to a similar conclusion that it's a little too perfect in the end, and that there's a design and there's reasoning behind a lot of it, and it inspires you. Um, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to let you talk anymore. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay, we can talk afterwards and play Fortnite. Okay. Okay.
Are you
Thank
going to
you
do
so
like
much.
an outro?
Okay, here I go. Thank you so much, Josh. Do you want to play Fortnite with me and leave this call?
Yes, let's do that instead. Oh, this sucked.
Thank you.